World of Warcraft has a rare problem. A series of hotfixes and blue posts are trying to address elite rares in Dragonflight, namely how players are engaging rares in Dragonflight zones and the drop rates of items that these players want. Now, under this most recent change, elite rares are going to despawn after 15 minutes if there aren't any players fighting it or at least nearby. It's meant to be an improvement that directs more players into fighting these active rares that people are actually farming, because before, when the whole map lit up with rares, it would get kind of sort of confusing as to where to start. Players would end up being separated out of, I guess, sheer panic, and I suppose in some mathematical equation, this set of changes probably works, but throughout Dragonflight, there have been a number of conversations about elite rares and also public group events that haven't been very flattering. So we're going to talk about what some of these issues are and ask ourselves if there are some solutions that work out for everyone in both the short and the long term. Hey, it's Soul. This is the video. Please like it and subscribe for more coverage. Catch me live, and let's start off with one of World of Warcraft's most beloved activities, complaining. Dragonflight has been full of these public encounters, from cooking soup to the Grand Hunt to time rifts and research expeditions. We're not going to talk about those because those were just bad, to the Forbidden Reach and rares, and of course the elite rares. And throughout the expansion, we've been seeing the following pattern kind of sort of repeat, where everyone's doing them and it's like a vibe, cool, and then weeks later there's a new patch and suddenly hardly anyone's doing it, and then it's a drag. What's been frustrating is that it took pretty much all expansion for the WoW team to finally get it mostly right in patch 10.2 with the Emerald Dream Zone and the pieces that made that a pretty friendly experience, even if your RNG might still suck. Different conversation. The complaints about rares specifically have been pretty loud and clear. At best, they're very time-consuming, and at worst, they're impossible to solo. Frame that around the typically lower drop rates of desired items, the respawn and the reactivation times, the weekly lockouts, and more, and you have a recipe for frustration. For many players who just casually farm up world content when their time allows, throughout a given season or even a patch, they have a pretty short window of opportunity before they find themselves standing in front of an elite rare or a time rift with no way to complete it on their own and no guarantee that the pre-made group finder tool thing is going to help them out. And what's really been aggravating is that Blizzard's iteration has been steady. Like I said, we're reaching a happy medium with 10.2 so far, but the progression up to this point has been glacial. So cutting to now, the proposed hotfixes focused mostly on directing players to active rares, which has been the last thing that critics have been asking for. Like, these folks have been shouting from the rooftops like, yo dude, just make rares easier to solo, with ideas like blanket nerfs to health after the season or the patch is over, or just better health scaling so it's more manageable to do when soloing. I myself have suggested even bodyguards to fill missing roles, so while elite rares might still be pretty spongy, at least they would go down with good play. Instead, though, the WoW team has mostly resisted going in the direction of nerfing difficulty. Now, in all fairness, it's not like there aren't any tools available to players at all in case they're alone. The pre-made group tool is pretty much the go-to in order to find groups hunting for rares. And of course, naturally, rares and elite rares become easier to defeat as we obtain gear from patch to patch, expansion to expansion. At least from memory, it's never been intentionally designed that players should expect to 100% complete an entire patch's worth of rewards while the patch or the season or even the expansion is current, because of the nature of those rewards. And maybe for some, that's awful game design. I also want to take some time to try and understand the WoW team's intentions, like what are they with elite rares and events, and what they've acknowledged are mistakes throughout Dragonflight. In other words, this is where I shamelessly defend the WoW team like a loyal sheep. There are consequences to getting a new content patch every 2 or so months that introduces something new and exciting to do in the outdoor world. I mean, sure, people flock to the new hotness, but they also flock away from the older stuff. With a rough average of 8 weeks between patches that directs us from one thing to the next, it's pretty simple psychology to identify that in some respects, content feels older at a faster rate. I'm sure you've heard from someone, or you might have thought this yourself, that when entering the likes of Dragonflight, the expansion, it can feel like once you're at max level, it can feel like really overwhelming to have so much to do, so much to collect, and it creates this feeling of being behind on stuff. Player power and story exposure have an obvious feeling of needing to catch up, but for collecting pets and toys and transmog, like what does it mean to fall behind in that particular subject? Is it an objectively real thing, or is it a burden that we place on ourselves individually? Now, I would like to think that yes, it's an individual feeling that often in discourse we project it onto others to make some safe arguments. But I've also noticed that with one patch after another, one bag of rewards and cosmetics to the next, this whole thing has brought out a certain sense of urgency from folks that they got to complete these collections by the time the next patch rolls out. Otherwise, OMG, they fall behind, not just because they're not done, but because it's going to be harder to complete. It's like some folks are coming with this with the same energy as needing to complete that best in slot collection to feel done with their characters before the season is over. Like, it's the collectors ahead of the curve or something like that. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just pointing it out. I really started hearing this sort of chatter back in Shadowlands, though, with the Covenants and the Sanctums, and there was a ton of rewards and cosmetics front-loaded onto this feature that was largely made up of outdoor solo content. And I remember some of the outcry from people pushing back against this, being like, dude, whoa, all this stuff is like way too demanding. How am I supposed to finish all this before the next patch? And they said that next patch, not the next expansion, but just the patch. And so I started to think that the traction really started to pick up around that time. The collector's side of the player base was gaining a voice, which is great. And, well, here's that voice today, demanding that rares be easier to solo right away, or at worst until the next patch when they ought to get some sort of nerf, because understandably, fewer people are farming those up. The feedback itself, it's totally fine. The projecting of energy onto me as if I'm supposed to think the way that they're thinking, as if I'm wrong for questioning it, it kind of sounds no different from all the other kinds of players who think that a certain change is better for everyone in the game. It's kind of like saying that yes, player housing is going to be loved by everyone and it's going to save the game, which it will. So just why is the WoW team ignoring all that feedback and focused more on how these elite rares are spawned like this is some sort of weird psychological calculus when, again, they could just increase the spawn rate and fix the scaling and let the players play and respect their time and pull the ripcord and so on and so forth. So let's look at the WoW team's response. They point out that, quote, the Zerlek Caverns map regularly displayed 12 to 15 rare elite enemies available to kill at any given time. This was not an occasional jackpot moment, it was the default state of the zone for most players who came along. Because of this, we regularly saw players who might want to take down those rare elites, but they and other characters were scattered around the zone. Due to the sheer number of different spawn points, players simply wouldn't come across other players who were looking to fight the same rare, even in Group Finder. Yesterday's hotfix was a step that we're taking to focus attention on fewer rares at a time and encourage the glorious murder balls that we all know and love. From my most current observations for these hotfixes, they're making fewer shards, which means more people per shard, and the drop rates of the rare items are meant to go up. So anyway, I did notice that elite rares in Zerlek Caverns spawn kind of funny, because at certain times of the day, my rare scanner would just explode because all of the rares would respawn at once. Now this was great because, I'd be like, okay, I want to farm that particular rare, and cool, now it's up. And I guess for the most part, that sort of player behavior is not exactly changing. Popular rares are still going to be camped, but again, why the weirdness? Why not just nerf these like, again, why not just nerf them like the players have been asking for? While it sounds like it ought to be the easy and reasonable response, just do those nerfs, at least to my memory, and my memory kind of sucks, this nerfing of rares after only a patch or a season, it's never really been a thing. The typical model has always been to just let time nerf what is old, from season to season, one expansion to the next, not unlike how it gets easier to solo raids and dungeons, with, of course, some exceptions. Somewhere down the line, and due to its design, players' patience just started to run really thin, notably in Dragonflight. But now I direct your attention to Eric Covington, a former designer at Blizzard who was part of the team who set up rares in the Forbidden Reach and in Zerlik Cavern. While the conversation was still fresh, he reached out over Twitter and asked folks, at what point should group content be made soloable? The answers were predictable, and I already mentioned them. The scaling should be better from the start, they say, or to give some sort of nerf. As soon as a new patch comes out, that's otherwise going to risk directing people away from this older stuff. Eric echoed a few of the observations that I pointed out, saying that in the case of these zones in Dragonflight, quote, we're seeing an accelerated case of consumption and obsolescence of content, at least in the perspective of the average player. And he's right. With these smaller patches that include outdoor activities comes two kinds of gameplay. You have this kind of short-term and long-term gameplay. Now, short-term gameplay includes the gear, power, things that'll get us killing stuff a little bit faster, that get our characters caught up faster so we can get to the real gaming, whatever that is. The long-term gameplay leans towards collectors. Now, of course, there are things that you'll be able to get right away and things that you obviously won't. So hey, come back to the zone because there's still that pet or mount or something that you still didn't get. Or hey, come to the old zone, new player, because you might have learned about a cool appearance that you can collect. What I've noticed is that some critics look at collections as the short-term gameplay as well, and the long-term gameplay in WoW just doesn't exist, or it only exists in this really miserable space. When we accept that sort of player behavior, it makes a lot more sense when they ask for rares to be nerfed or to be designed to be soloable from the onset. The question then is, what direction should the game be moving towards? Now, at the risk of being hyperbolic, I don't think that the collection side of the game should have that seasonal completionist feel like raids or dungeons or PvP. I also don't think it's okay that players should feel pressured into needing to finish now because it's going to be harder to do later. The game, especially outdoor content, should feel easier to do because of new levels and gear that make up for the lack of people. But it also shouldn't be filled with so much anti-RNG that it kills off any sense of thrill that the item that you wanted finally dropped. I think something's lost when the excitement of a drop is replaced with more like this relieving feeling of fulfilling a vendor transaction. So I have some small ideas, just small ones, because I feel strongly that in 10.2 the WoW team they've been doing a lot right. So one idea is to have just fewer of these rare elites available at any given time, period. Like in Zerlik Cavern, there were over 10 that would spawn at once, and understandably, that's kind of overwhelming. Eric replied to one of my posts saying as much, and that the current hotfixes that the team is planning properly address that particular concern. In the Emerald Dream, there's fewer than half as many of these elite rares, but there's a good handful of regular, I call them baby rares. They're non-elites, they're perfectly killable, but they'll still have, some mechanics that'll give you trouble if you're not paying attention. Now, as for the elite rares, I'm a bit inspired by the Super Bloom event with a predictable rotation. I think that's a big takeaway, so here's an idea. In a given zone, whatever new zone that's coming, there might be 5 or so of these elite rares, and there's going to be like some baby rares scattered all around too. And let's pretend it's 9:59 in the morning, it's 1 minute before 10. If the rare elites in the zone are still alive, they'll just like run away or despawn or something like that. No elite rares are going to be up for 1 minute, and then right at 10 o'clock, something's going to start. One of the 5 rares is going to spawn. They're not going to be attackable yet. They're going to start some sort of countdown, like a 2-minute countdown before it does become active. This is something that we've been seeing in the Emerald Dream Zone and numerous other times in WoW. Now, 5 minutes after that, the second rare is going to do its own 2-minute cooldown, and then it's going to activate, and then another 5-minute passes before the third raid spawns, and blah, blah, blah. And then the 5th spawns, and then boom, if none of them were killed, we would just have all 5 of these elite rares that are up. So when the zone is crowded, the death ball of players is just going to jump from one elite rare to the next, to the next, to the next until done, and then we just kind of rest until the next time. And if you miss that train, well, you just gotta wait for that predetermined time when that line of rare spawns happen again. When it's not so crowded, the limited number of elite rares, they're gonna spawn on, some sort of schedule that Wowhead can set a clock to, and then you just show up at that appropriate time. As for the elite rares themselves, like as for fighting them, the encounters ought to be designed in such a way that a solo player would struggle if they happen to be in greens, but mostly be able to solo it if they can get some solid epics within that season. And in the upcoming War Within expansion, that's going to be possible with the help of Delves and the Great Vault, which ought to give some pretty powerful gear. Now, as for complexity, these elite rares are going to have, I would guess, like spec agnostic challenges to overcome, as opposed to just, you know, beating you in the face and you got to stay alive. Like, for example, maybe these elites will make you catch some power up that it drops and then you get some bonus damage, but you also need to avoid swirlies that'll do percentage damage or lower your max health, you know, the kind of damage that will punish your character even if you happen to be heavily geared. So quality over quantity rares, something that could feel like a world boss, but instead give, you know, instead of raid level gear, it's going to be cosmetics or outdoor currency or reputation. And most importantly, these are going to spawn at predictable and easy to understand schedules. Now, I say this often, but with World of Warcraft, variety is the spice of life, from its encounters to its rewards to how they're given out. The idea of rare elites, it took a turn with Dragonflight, and while it's taken a while, it's turning back around and going in a better direction, in my opinion, and it could just use a little bit more of a nudge. What the WoW team recently did with Forbidden Reach and Zerlite Caverns was what it was. It's just a hotfix. It's a band-aid. It's an immediate solution while time takes care of the rest. Now, as for the future, I was just mentioning this, I'm thinking of something to the effect of a rotation of rares that spawn in sequence, and all you'd have to do as the player is to be on at the right time and in the right place to get on to this ride of farming rares. And otherwise, when folks have moved on and you don't overwhelmingly outgear it, yeah, it's going to be tougher, but it's going to be a challenge that's meant to be beaten. This whole setup doesn't sound like much, and that's also the point. There's also been a dependence on these really beefy elite rares in most of Dragonflight, and hopefully another big takeaway is to move the slider more in favor of, you know, just other rewarding activities like the Time Rift Warfront or Mythic Plus Grand Hunts and Soup Torghast Edition. Yeah. So Anyway, thanks for listening. Like the video, subscribe for more coverage, and of course, catch me live for a chat. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay breezy.